Forget everything you know about medieval defense, because most people didn't have castles. No moats, no stone walls, no knights in shining armor. Just terrified peasants, armed with pitchforks and desperation, staring down raiders, warlords, and plague. But what they lacked in fortresses, they made up for with pure grit and genius. Booby-trapped fields? Check. Armed grandmas? You bet. Secret alliances and fake watchmen? Absolutely. And wait until you hear how some villages defended themselves by vanishing completely. Stick around, because the most shocking defenses weren't built with stone. They were built with community. Imagine living in a town with no police, no army base, no security cameras, not even a lock on your door. Now imagine hearing the thud of hooves or the clash of swords as armed raiders approach your home. That's what it was like for millions of medieval peasants in unfortified villages. Castles. Those were a luxury. Most people lived and died without ever setting foot in one. So how did they survive? It starts with desperation. In the Middle Ages, especially from the 9th to the 13th century, Europe was like a violent startup phase, chaotic, opportunistic, and lawless in the margins. Vikings sailed up rivers and burned towns to the ground. Magyar horsemen thundered in from the east. Bandits, rogue knights, and feuding lords turned peaceful farming villages into bloodbaths overnight. Without stone walls or trained soldiers, survival wasn't a given. It was a daily negotiation. But peasants weren't helpless. In fact, their ingenuity under pressure was downright savage. Take the humble wooden palisade. Picture a tall wall of sharpened logs driven deep into a trench, sometimes with an earth mound behind it for reinforcement. These weren't elegant fortresses. They were raw, spiked fences that could be thrown up fast using local timber. Some villages ringed themselves in multiple layers. The point wasn't to win a siege, it was to make attacking more trouble than it was worth. Digging deeper, literally, some communities turned the surrounding fields into trap-ridden death zones. Pit traps covered with brush, spiked holes for horses to fall into, ditches filled with thorny branches or even human waste to spread disease among attackers. The goal wasn't to repel a professional army, it was to frustrate, injure, and delay long enough for help to arrive, or for raiders to get bored and move on. In places like Anglo-Saxon England, village defense often came down to the fyrd, a kind of people's militia. Every able-bodied man had to answer the call, whether he had combat experience or not. That meant your local blacksmith, miller, or shepherd might suddenly be swinging an axe in defense of the village church. Weapons were whatever you had: sickles, clubs, pitchforks, even sharpened farming tools. Think of it like the medieval version of a neighborhood watch, with torches and spears instead of walkie-talkies. And don't imagine these villagers just stood around waiting to be slaughtered. They trained. Some records from Carolingian France mention communal drills, where men practiced forming shield walls or learned how to sound alarms. Horn blasts, bell towers, and smoke signals all played a role in early warning systems. A well-coordinated village could rally faster than a disorganized band of attackers, and that element of unity often made all the difference. Now let's talk about alliances, because not every defense was built with wood and sweat. Some villages struck protection deals with nearby lords. In exchange for grain, livestock, or loyalty, a local noble might offer a few knights or the promise of retaliation if the village was attacked. This wasn't charity, it was business. Lords saw these agreements as a way to extend their influence without overextending their forces. Villagers saw them as a lifeline, even if it meant handing over their sons for labor or military service. Sound familiar? It should. It's not that different from how modern small businesses pay for private security or form alliances with local government. You give up a little freedom for a little more safety. But here's the twist. Sometimes the lords were the problem. In feudal Europe, the line between noble and raider was blurry. A knight from the next territory over might claim your village owed him taxes and enforce that claim by burning your crops or kidnapping your livestock. So villages had to play politics, learning which factions to flatter, which banners to fear, and which names to drop when trouble came knocking. And sometimes, the best defense was simply hiding. Villages built refuge woods, dense, booby-trapped thickets where families could flee in case of attack. In the Swiss Alps, entire communities carved hideouts into cliffs and mountain passes. In Poland and Lithuania, villages relocated seasonally to avoid detection by Mongol raiders. Think of it like medieval camouflage, vanishing into the landscape when the threat became too great. It's hard to overstate how much these villagers had to rely on one another, There was no calling 911, no cavalry charge at the last minute. Your survival depended on how tightly your community was bound, how fast you could mobilize, how well you trusted your neighbor to guard your back, and how willing you were to fight for land that, legally, might not even be yours. Modern life has its dangers, but most of us don't spend our days building spike pits or checking the tree line for horsemen. We call locksmiths when we lose our keys. Back then, you'd better hope your neighbor's 7-year-old knew how to wield a slingshot. The brutality of medieval village defense wasn't just about violence, it was about creativity under constant threat. These people weren't knights. They were farmers, mothers, and children who had to think like strategists just to stay alive. And as we'll see in the next part, things got even more intense when outside threats escalated beyond raiders into full-blown wars. As war drums began to echo louder across the European countryside, the fragile peace of the unfortified village shattered like thin ice under a boot. For all their pit traps, palisades, and peasant militias, these communities were never built to withstand a full-scale military campaign. And yet, they had to try. By the time the 100 Years' War rolled across France, village life was swept into the meat grinder of dynastic conflict. English chevauché raids, fast-moving scorched earth campaigns, were particularly brutal. These weren't orderly battles. They were economic terrorism. Armies burned fields, torched granaries, and cut down orchards, systematically destroying a village's ability to feed itself. So villages adapted again. One method? Strategic burning. It sounds mad, but some communities deliberately set fire to their own fields or stored grain to deny raiders resources. Better to starve together than let the enemy feast. In 1365, villagers in southern France were documented torching their wine stores before English forces arrived. It was a statement. You can take our land, but you'll go thirsty doing it. In parts of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire's patchwork of semi-independent villages came up with an answer rooted in sheer geography. They built hilltop refuges, not castles, but crude fortifications on high ground that villagers could flee to with livestock and valuables. These were often surrounded by dry moats, earthen walls, and sometimes just a ring of angry farmers with bows and a burning sense of defiance. The community of Eppenstein in Austria is a prime example. In the 14th century, it turned its church into a makeshift fortress. Thickened walls, arrow slits carved into the bell tower, and even slots for pouring boiling water or pitch on attackers. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. The church became the heart of village defense, not just spiritually, but strategically. But not every village had the luxury of stone buildings or hills. In the flat, open lands of the Low Countries or central Poland, defense meant digging in, literally. Trenches, berms, and layered wooden barricades snaked around homes and livestock pens. These were manned not just by men, but by entire families. There are chronicles describing women pouring lye or scalding water from thatched rooftops, while children ran messages between defensive posts. The idea of total mobilization wasn't invented in the 20th century. It was alive in medieval hamlets where every pair of hands counted. In northern Italy, communes organized rotating defense shifts. Someone always on watch, even at night. They built guard towers out of grain silos, using their height for visibility and their thick walls for last-ditch protection. And as war turned from seasonal raiding to prolonged conflict, psychological warfare took root. Villagers started erecting fake watchmen, wooden silhouettes or stuffed dummies dressed in armor on the perimeter. They'd light extra torches at night to make their numbers look larger. In desperate times, illusion was as valuable as iron. But the most creative tactic of all might have been the use of sound. Some villages used massive horns made of animal bone or wood, blown during attacks to summon aid or disorient enemies. In parts of Wales, these war horns could be heard for miles. There's a recorded case from the 13th century of a village using synchronized bell rings to signal an attack in progress, triggering nearby settlements to send reinforcements. Think of it as an early medieval group chat, loud, slow, and absolutely life-saving. Meanwhile, a darker solution emerged, buying off the enemy. It was common for villages to scrape together ransoms or tribute in advance. Raiders knew which places paid fast and which fought hard. In some records, you'll find notations like, "This place is generous," scribbled into mercenary ledgers. For peasant leaders, it was brutal calculus, pay and stay alive, or resist and risk annihilation. One chilling example comes from Burgundy during the 15th century, where a village reportedly gathered their life savings, silver coins, jewelry, even church relics, and sent them on a cart to meet an advancing mercenary band. The ploy worked, but the psychological scar ran deep. Imagine explaining to your children why their family heirlooms were now in the hands of men who would have killed them otherwise. Over time, these desperate strategies gave rise to codified systems of rural defense. In parts of Bohemia and Bavaria, regional councils were formed that mapped out alert networks and mutual defense pacts between villages. If one was attacked, others were obliged to send help or risk being blacklisted from future support. This proto-federation mindset was centuries ahead of its time. It was the seed of collective security. Still, the stress fractured communities. Fear of spies or traitors led to internal purges. Some villages accused neighbors of collaborating with raiders, leading to lynchings or exile. There's a record from Saxony in the 14th century of a village stoning its own elder after a failed defense, believing he had made secret promises to the enemy. When death felt inevitable, paranoia thrived. Modern parallels abound. During World War II, villagers in occupied Europe used many of the same tactics, hiding in forests, forming militias, sending children with coded messages, even sabotaging their own supplies. The stakes and tools changed, but the instinct for community-led resistance remained terrifyingly consistent. What's most staggering is that these villages persisted. They didn't just endure, they adapted, evolved, and occasionally thrived amid constant threat. After all, war couldn't last forever. Armies moved on, seasons changed, and when peace returned even briefly, villages rebuilt fast, replacing what was burned, replanting what was trampled, burying what was lost. But the scars ran deep. Defense changed not just the architecture of villages, but their very culture. Stories of heroic last stands or clever deceptions passed down as local legends. Songs were sung not just of saints and kings, but of the nameless farmer who fended off 3 bandits with a scythe. Memory became part of the battlements. And yet, even as villages hardened, the threats only escalated. Because eventually it wasn't just raiders or rival armies that threatened them, it was the very lords they once trusted for protection. In the next part, we'll uncover how those sworn to defend the people sometimes turned their blades inward, and how villagers learned to resist their own rulers. It's one thing to defend your home from faceless outsiders, bandits, raiders, foreign armies. But what happens when the threat rides in under your own flag? When the people who were supposed to protect you become your exploiters, your tormentors, even your executioners? For medieval villagers, this betrayal wasn't a plot twist. It was a pattern. By the late Middle Ages, the feudal system had calcified into something cruelly predictable. Lords held absolute power over the land, and, by extension, over the people living on it. In theory, they provided protection in exchange for loyalty and labor. In practice, they bled villages dry. Taxes rose steeply, labor demands increased, and when those weren't enough, outright extortion filled the gap. Villages once under siege by invaders now found themselves under siege by their own protectors. This wasn't subtle. A noble could demand grain under the pretense of wartime need, then sell it for profit elsewhere, or require young men to serve as soldiers, only to abandon their families without compensation. In Normandy, one 14th century village was stripped of every draft animal it owned by a local knight raising funds for a private dispute. Without oxen, the fields lay fallow. Hunger followed. The villagers had no legal recourse. So what did they do? Some complied. Some fled. But others, more than we often acknowledge, fought back. Welcome to the murky, dangerous world of peasant resistance. It wasn't organized rebellion, at least not at first. It was passive sabotage, hiding grain, falsifying tax records, losing livestock. Entire villages conspired to underreport births so they wouldn't owe more in labor obligations. If you think tax evasion is a modern concept, think again. Medieval peasants practically wrote the playbook. Eventually, desperation boiled over into open defiance. One of the most explosive examples was the Jacquerie of 1358 in France. Fed up with the brutality of local lords, especially after the devastation of the Black Death, peasants in the Ile-de-France region rose up with shocking violence. They attacked manor houses, burned noble estates, and killed anyone wearing armor. Their tools were crude: sickles, hammers, even farm equipment. but their rage was honed by decades of exploitation. The uprising was crushed brutally, of course, but it terrified the nobility. For the first time in generations, they saw that unarmed villagers, when united and furious, could bring down the social order with nothing but numbers and sheer fury. It didn't matter that they lost. What mattered was that they dared. Other revolts followed. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw entire communities march on London, demanding the end of serfdom and oppressive taxation. They were organized, they were loud, and for a brief moment, they held power. Though it ended in betrayal and executions, the message had been sent. And this wasn't just about politics, it was survival. In many cases, villages prepared for lordly retaliation with the same ingenuity they'd once reserved for foreign invaders. They reinforced barns as strongholds, buried food supplies to avoid seizure, and sent scouts to track the movements of tax collectors or armed guards. A fascinating tactic arose in parts of Hungary and Transylvania: false compliance. Villagers would pretend to welcome a lord's enforcers, feed them, show them full stores, even offer token gifts, then vanish the next day, often taking their livestock and tools into forest hideouts. These hideouts were equipped with supplies, sometimes hidden churches or altars, and were passed down through generations like family secrets. Some were so well hidden they weren't rediscovered until modern archaeologists stumbled on them centuries later. Then there's the story of the Taborites, a radical Czech peasant movement that emerged during the Hussite Wars. Though rooted in religious dissent, they transformed into a full-blown defensive community. They built wagon forts, circles of armored carts turned into mobile strongholds. From within these crude contraptions, peasants repelled trained knights and imperial armies. It was DIY military engineering at its finest. In rural Spain, a different form of resistance took hold: legal defense. Believe it or not, some villages hired scribes to draft petitions and appeals, exploiting gaps in feudal law. Monks and literate clerics were sometimes sympathetic and helped compile documents challenging illegal seizures or abuses. A Catalan village in 1410 successfully delayed a tax increase for 3 years simply by drowning their lord in parchment and loopholes. Bureaucratic warfare at its medieval best. But all of this came at a cost. Lords didn't forget disobedience. Reprisals could be swift and savage. Crops burned, homes razed, leaders publicly hanged. In one German principality, an entire village was relocated as punishment after refusing a new tax. The survivors were scattered across neighboring lands, their original home bulldozed by oxen and fire. And yet, for every brutal suppression, there were a dozen quiet acts of defiance that went unpunished, simply because they weren't discovered. This was the true weapon of the village: collective secrecy. You didn't need a spy network when every grandmother and stable boy knew how to keep their mouth shut. It's easy to draw comparisons here with modern civil resistance movements. Think of factory workers slowing production during labor disputes, or rural communities today refusing mining operations through legal and grassroots pressure. The playbook changes, but the motive stays the same: protect what's yours when those in power won't, or can't. By the 15th century, some villages even began forming contracts with towns or other villages, promising mutual support in cases of noble abuse. These weren't military alliances in the traditional sense, they were survival pacts. Some included food-sharing agreements, rotating lookouts, or joint legal representation. Imagine a peasant NATO built not on ideology, but pure necessity. Still, the very idea of autonomy terrified medieval elites, so they doubled down. They built more fortresses, passed stricter laws, increased surveillance through bailiffs and reeves. In England, after the Peasants' Revolt, laws were enacted that made it illegal for a laborer to ask for higher wages, even during a labor shortage. That's right. Asking for a raise was literally a crime, but repression had its limits. Villages, by sheer will and unity, carved out spaces of independence. Not full freedom, not sovereignty, but breathing room. A space to survive, to grow crops without theft, to raise families without fear of sudden violence from their own so-called guardians. That hard-won space would prove vital in the coming century as new threats emerged, not from armies, but from within. Because while lords might bleed a village slowly, the next enemy would kill swiftly, invisibly, and without mercy. In the next part, we dive into how medieval villages faced down the most terrifying killer of them all: plague. The first cough was dismissed. A chill in the air, perhaps. a bad batch of barley beer. But soon there were more. Coughs that wouldn't stop, black welts on the neck, fevers that cooked the mind and split the body open from within. Death didn't arrive on horseback or with a sword this time. It crept in quietly, through trade routes, rat nests, and open windows. And no amount of spikes, traps, or spears could keep it out. When the Black Death hit Europe in the mid-14th century, villages, already battered by war, taxes, and betrayal, faced something far worse, an invisible, merciless killer. Estimates say it wiped out between 30 to 60% of the European population. In some areas, entire villages vanished, leaving only skeletons and collapsing rooftops behind. At first, peasants tried to apply the same survival instincts they'd honed for generations. Barricades went up, not against soldiers this time, but against their own neighbors. Villages sealed themselves off. Anyone showing symptoms was exiled, or worse. In Tuscany, a record tells of villagers locking a feverish boy and his family in their cottage and setting it ablaze, hoping to contain the spread. Medieval crisis management was often savage, but rooted in a single desperate instinct: survive, no matter what. And survive they did, somehow. In fact, some villages fared better than towns or cities, precisely because of their defensive habits. Isolation, once a burden, became a blessing. Rural communities who blocked roads, posted guards, or fled to mountain pastures saw significantly lower mortality rates. A village in the Swiss Alps closed its mountain pass entirely for over a year, surviving the first wave of plague with only minor losses. But the disease didn't just kill people, it shattered systems. Labor vanished overnight. Fields went untended. Mills stopped turning. Livestock died in barns because no one was left to feed them. Entire family lines were extinguished in a week. And once the plague passed through, villages weren't met with relief. They were met with vultures. Lords and church officials swooped in, trying to seize abandoned land or increase taxes on the survivors. The logic was ruthless. Fewer peasants meant more work per person, and more profit for those in power. But villagers had changed. Death had stripped them of fear. They weren't the same obedient tenants anymore. In some regions, survivors used the chaos to their advantage. They demanded better terms, lower rents, personal freedoms, more control over their crops. And incredibly, some got what they asked for. Landowners, desperate to keep anyone working the soil, agreed to conditions that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. This marked the beginning of a quiet revolution. For the first time in centuries, the power dynamic tilted, ever so slightly, toward the bottom. In England, this shift was so pronounced that Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which tried to freeze wages and force peasants to accept pre-plague conditions. It didn't work. People knew their worth now, and they knew how to defend it. Defense in this new era wasn't about spikes and moats. It was about control over space and access. Villages began reshaping themselves physically, moving houses further apart, fencing off private land, and setting clearer boundaries between us and them. The communal model of shared fields and common forests began to erode in favor of private plots. Safety no longer came from numbers. It came from distance. Some villages developed rudimentary quarantine zones, temporary huts on the outskirts where travelers or the sick were made to stay. In parts of France and Italy, these pest houses became semi-permanent features. Villagers posted watchmen and limited access to wells, markets, and churches. It was primitive public health, enforced by fear and habit. Religion, always a pillar of medieval life, became both refuge and weapon. Some communities doubled down on rituals, processions, fasts, prayers, and pilgrimages to ward off the pestilence. Others turned suspicious. Who had brought this curse upon them? Outsiders, witches, heretics? Jewish communities were often scapegoated, leading to horrific massacres even in remote areas. But not all reactions were violent. Some villages, perhaps more jaded or pragmatic, turned inward and leaned on communal resilience. They revived old defense networks, not for fighting armies, but for distributing food and care. Shared granaries reappeared. Midwives became frontline medics. Gravediggers became heroes. And in this darkness, a strange kind of unity formed. A brotherhood of survival forged in mass death. Modern minds might expect such trauma to destroy social bonds, but in many places, it did the opposite. Survivors depended on one another more than ever. If you were lucky enough to live through the pestilence, it was often because your neighbors fed you, buried your dead, or let you sleep in their barn when your family was gone. The village, once a defensive cell, became a healing one. Still, the fear never fully lifted. The plague didn't vanish, it came in waves. And each time it returned, villages adapted more quickly. Masks made of cloth or herbs became common among those tending the sick. In some communities, midwives and herbalists developed local protocols. Burn straw beds after use, don't share eating utensils, keep children separate from elders. These weren't based on germ theory, but on keen observation and bitter experience. Interestingly, this period also saw a rise in folk knowledge, remedies, warnings, cures passed down orally. One Italian village near Bergamo kept a plague book in its chapel, documenting symptoms and what treatments had worked or failed during previous outbreaks. Though unscientific by today's standards, it showed an evolving awareness of disease cycles and communal memory. And amidst all this, another transformation was underway. With so many dead, land became more available. Some serfs moved into abandoned manors, claiming land for themselves. Others banded together and built new hamlets in the gaps left behind. Villages weren't just recovering, they were expanding, experimenting, even reinventing themselves. This process wasn't easy or uniform. Some areas remained locked in feudal grips, others collapsed entirely. But where villages had strong internal organization, where defense and cooperation had been priorities before the plague, they rebounded faster. They rebuilt homes, replanted fields, and re-established trade routes. Resilience wasn't just luck, it was strategy. Perhaps the most astonishing legacy of the plague was how it democratized fear. For once, lords and peasants died in roughly equal numbers. Death didn't care about lineage. This shared vulnerability subtly shifted how people saw themselves and each other. A knight who once terrorized a village might now beg a peasant for food. A church official once feared now lay buried in the same ditch as a washerwoman. In time, this invisible equalizer would sow seeds of radical thought. If death treated all men the same, why didn't the law? Why did power remain chained to birth and wealth? The question started quietly, in alehouses, markets, and field corners. But they would grow louder, generation by generation. For now, though, the villagers did what they always did. They endured. They adjusted. They watched the tree line, sharpened their tools, and taught their children how to live in a world that could kill you without warning. But as the plague waned and stability returned, a new chapter opened. Trade resumed. Roads were rebuilt. Soldiers once again marched across familiar paths. And the next threats to village life wouldn't be disease or war, but progress. In the final part, we'll explore how medieval villages faced the slow, creeping transformation of the world around them, and how they defended their way of life against the very future itself. The thunder of hooves had quieted. The plague had ebbed. The fields were tilled once more, and life somehow resumed. But peace was deceptive, because as the dust of old horrors settled, something subtler began to stir. Something that couldn't be spiked, barricaded, or scared off. It wasn't a warlord or a disease. It was change. By the 15th century, the medieval village stood at a crossroads. The threats it had endured for centuries, raiders, corrupt lords, famine, plague, had shaped its very bones. Every hedgerow was planted with purpose. Every church steeple was a watchtower in waiting. But now, with those threats fading or mutating, a new kind of danger loomed. The slow, unrelenting creep of progress. On paper, this was a time of growth. Populations recovered. Trade boomed, markets expanded, towns swelled into cities, and with them came roads, law courts, coin economies, and officials with polished boots and clipped speech. At first, this looked like a blessing. Villagers could sell surplus grain at distant fairs, buy imported goods, or even hire scribes to manage disputes. But it came with strings, many strings. The most immediate change was the enclosure movement. What had once been common land, shared forests, pastures, and streams, was being fenced off, often with royal approval. Nobles and wealthy merchants saw profit in privatizing what had always belonged to everyone. That patch of woods where your father hunted rabbits? Gone. That stream where your children fetched water? Now behind a gate. In England, this became so extreme that entire villages were displaced to make room for sheep. Wool had become gold, and human lives were less profitable than fleece. Villagers returned from market to find their homes dismantled, their fields overrun with grazing animals, their rights erased by a wax seal and a nobleman's whim. Resistance flared. People tore down fences, sabotaged surveys, and blocked roads. But the legal tide was against them. Courts favored landlords. Laws favored consolidation. Defense, in this era, wasn't about holding a line. It was about resisting erasure. Because what was being attacked wasn't the body of the village. It was its soul. And it wasn't just England. Across Europe, as royal authority centralized, villages found themselves bypassed by power. Decisions that once involved village elders were now made by bureaucrats in distant cities. The local reeve was replaced by a royal bailiff. Customary law was overwritten by charters. Even the church, once the heart of village identity, was being transformed by reform and counter-reform. Priests were replaced, rituals changed, languages shifted from local dialects to Latinized rigidity. So villages did what they had always done, adapted. But this time, the adaptations were quieter, more psychological. They withdrew into themselves. Local traditions, songs, dances, storytelling, seasonal rites, became acts of cultural defense. If they couldn't control the laws, they could at least control memory. In parts of Bavaria, villagers began holding secret harvest festivals, banned by reformist preachers who saw them as pagan. In the Scottish Highlands, clans passed down oral histories that defied official accounts. In rural France, villagers preserved outlawed saints' days by renaming them and celebrating in private. These were not grand rebellions. They were acts of survival, of identity, of saying, "We are still here," in a world that increasingly saw them as obsolete. Yet not all change was resisted. Some was embraced, selectively. Villages learned to navigate the new world. They sent younger sons to apprentice in towns, not out of shame, but as investment. They negotiated better terms with nobles using knowledge picked up from merchant travelers. They built schools, not for prestige, but to ensure the next generation could read contracts and avoid being cheated. And they began to bargain with the future. Some formed cooperatives to share tools or sell goods in bulk. Others pooled resources to build mills, bridges, or chapels, claiming space in a changing landscape. The same instinct that once built palisades now built institutions. But for every village that thrived, another vanished. The march of progress was uneven and unforgiving. When a new road bypassed your fields, when a river route dried up, when a landlord decided your soil wasn't worth the tax, you faded. Not with fire and screaming, but with silence. Fields went fallow, roofs caved in, maps changed, and in time, even the name was forgotten. Modern historians estimate that hundreds of medieval villages simply disappeared between the 15th and 17th centuries, ghosted by history, their graves unmarked. Some were swallowed by forests, others were paved over by towns. Occasionally, a farmer unearths a pottery shard or the corner of a foundation, a brief flicker of memory. But even as these places died, their spirit lived on in those that remained. Because while kings rose and fell, while empires expanded and collapsed, the village endured. It morphed. It compromised. It redefined itself. And through that stubbornness, it taught us something vital. That defense isn't just about keeping enemies out. It's about holding on to who you are, even when the world insists you be something else. The final transformation came with the age of printing, exploration, and early capitalism. Ideas moved faster. Coins replaced barter. Roads became arteries of empire. And yet, if you walked into many villages in 1600, you'd still see the bones of the past. The same field boundaries, the same thatched roofs, the same traditions whispered under breath. Because even as villagers embraced clocks, weights, or written contracts, they still gathered under the old oak tree to settle disputes. They still rang the same church bell to mark a death or marriage. They still taught their children the names of those who once dug trenches, fought off nights, or outlasted a pestilence. In this way, the village didn't vanish. It evolved. It became the bedrock of what we now call local identity, grassroots politics, community resilience. In every neighborhood council, every volunteer fire brigade, every barn raising or mutual aid society, you can still hear echoes of that medieval instinct. Protect each other, protect the land, protect the memory. And maybe that's the final truth. Castles may have crumbled, kingdoms may have shifted, But the unfortified village, the one without towers or walls, was never defenseless. Its weapon was always its people, its history, its refusal to surrender to oblivion. Because in the end, survival wasn't just about beating back enemies. It was about staying rooted when the whole world tried to uproot you. And on that front, the medieval village didn't just endure. It won. We like to think we're safe today, behind deadbolts, passwords, and police patrols. But medieval villagers survived centuries of chaos with none of that. No walls, no standing armies, just community, creativity, and raw determination. They faced betrayal from their own lords, death from unseen plague, and slow erasure by progress itself, and still, they held on. So what does that say about us? Could we defend our neighborhoods if the grid went down tomorrow? Would we band together or break apart? And what's the modern version of a spiked fence or a watchtower? Leave a comment and let us know. If this journey into medieval survival blew your mind, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There's a lot more grit and guts where that came from.